Welcome to Exit Capitalism, Stage Left. This is your host, Manda Riggle. This podcast is brought to you by the Maggie Fair Institute for Democracy and Human Rights. The primary purpose of the Maggie Fair Institute for Democracy and Human Rights is to educate people, especially young people, about democracy and human rights. This purpose will be achieved through, but is not limited to, such practices as hiring an educator, sponsoring projects, sponsoring forums and workshops, showing educational films, operating a library, developing educational materials, and sponsoring podcasts like the one you're listening to today. So today, if you couldn't tell by the intro music, we're going to be changing things up a little bit. The show is now going to consist of 5 segments. The first is going to be looking at human rights U.S. news. This is a segment where I pull a few news stories, not all of the news stories that cover human rights in the U.S. because there'd be way too many, and provide some opinions and some analysis. Then we're going to go into some recommended reading. I am by nature an academic. I do a lot of reading. My degrees are in English, so I figured this would be a good place to recommend some books to people who would be interested in learning more about where some of my thoughts and opinions come from and what they were formed by, as far as my critical evaluations against capitalism as a system that definitely exploits and definitely violates our basic human rights. Then will be the main segment of the show, or what we've been doing, where we cover a main topic. For today, we actually have an interview with a former Starbucks employee, where we'll be talking about Starbucks working conditions, their experience as a worker there, as well as their opinions on unionizing, or the unionizing that's been taking place at Starbucks across the nation. Then we're going to kind of review some of the resources on the Maggie Fair Institute website for people who are interested in learning more, having some more support. Besides this podcast, we have infographics, we have informational blog posts, we have those recommended reading lists, we have lesson plans, things of that nature. And then finally, we're going to do our outro and just kind of talk about how we'd like to hear from you guys. Right now, we don't have anything, but in the future, if people would like to send in questions, comments, or concerns, our last segment would be a place where we can address that. And that segment is going to have an email. So we do have an official email now, and I will repeat this at the end. But you guys can now send emails to exitcapitalismstageleft@gmail.com. All just one word. And I can hear directly from you, and you can hopefully say nice things directly to me. I guess I will find out. With all that said, let's go ahead and jump into our first segment, which is now Human Rights U.S. News. And the first topic I wanted to cover was the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. As of this month, January 2022, the CDC has changed their return to work recommendations for COVID. And you can find that directly on the CDC's website, www.cdc.gov. On top of reducing the amount of time workers should be spending away from work so as not to continue and spread the disease, because we're still in a pandemic. I'm still baffled. I'll go over this before I go over to the next topic. So it's interesting to watch the CDC become a trusted source of information under the Trump administration on COVID-19, to release up-to-date medical info, to give the 14 feet. It was originally 14 feet outdoor and indoor distance mandate, the mask, updates saying all of these things that we actually needed and being correct, to under the Biden administration pulling back on a lot of those recommendations for the sake of capitalism, not for our health, but so the market can thrive. And I even question that logic of the market thriving, because if people are dying and if people are kind of like forced to work and then forced to isolate due to the continued spread of the pandemic, is the market really thriving as much as it would have if we just stayed home for a couple of months and let the disease die, out a bit, or at least reduce in number to the point to where it's not as spread as it is? And I guess on that note, share the formula for the vaccines with other countries so that they can also vaccinate themselves and not just hoard vaccinations. But I guess that's a little different than the CDC directly, but we do see the CDC reducing. The first thing I personally noticed, because I work in academia, is the removal of the 14 feet indoor mandate to a 6 feet or less mandate. And this was specifically to accommodate children in classrooms or adult students in college classrooms. This was not for anybody's health and safety. This was so changes didn't need to be made to these institutions, and they could once again reinstate in-person classroom meetings without making any kind of changes to how the classroom is structured. And many people might not think this is directly related to capitalism because it's related to education, but we have to remember that places like the UC are the largest employers in the state of California, and they generate a huge revenue for the state itself. Education is now a money-making machine, especially higher education. It's no longer about educating people, it's about profit. So if anybody has that doubt, there's the explanation. But yes, so the CDC has continued their trend of becoming the most distrusted after being the most trusted source on COVID-19 recommendations, and they have reduced the amount of time workers should stay home, which is ridiculous. People need, even before it was ridiculous, I know I personally had a COVID-19 scare during our last quarter of school. It turned out I got a negative test, but before I even had my negative test that said I did not have COVID-19, my campus didn't require much proof. I sent in our daily wellness check saying I was going to be on campus, but I did not feel well, to let them know. And then the response was, don't come in for 14 days. It wasn't 14 days after you feel better and you aren't exhibiting symptoms. It wasn't, show us 2 negative COVID tests, which I know some workplaces do, before you're able to be reinstated. It was just don't come in for 14 days. And that was the blanket policy. And now, thanks to the CDC reducing their recommendation for workplaces and the return to work after a COVID exposure or scare, that 14-day period is going to be further reduced. So that is our first bit of news related to COVID-19. The second, of course, which I think everybody would be expecting, the U.S. Supreme Court blocks a nationwide vaccine testing mandate for workers. And this makes all of us more unsafe at work and at home. It's interesting to see, and our next segment is actually related to the, our next news story, I should say, is also related to the Supreme Court. It's very interesting to see that the Supreme Court has taken an active stance. So if we think back at the history of the Supreme Court, usually they're very reactionary. There are some quote unquote activist courts like the Warren Court, which is where we get Brown versus the Board of Education, the 1954 and 56 decisions. And we see some groundbreaking cases later, like Planned Parenthood, that's actually the current standard of Roe versus Wade, as far as abortion goes. But for the most part, courts are reactionary. But we're seeing almost the exact opposite in our current Supreme Court, where it is not reactionary, it is proactive, but it is proactive in the opposite way the Warren Court was. Instead of trying to ensure human rights, our court has taken a very open stance at reducing human rights and our access to things that keep our body safe and violating bodily autonomy. And I know a lot of people might argue that blocking vaccine testing and blocking a vaccine mandate even, which that wasn't what they blocked, it was just testing, is a way of upholding bodily autonomy rights. But there are multiple rights. There are rights to and there are rights from. And right now, what the Supreme Court is backing is a reduction in our rights from being exposed to COVID. And what they're granting is, I would say, probably not a right to infect other people, which shouldn't be allowed. So that's my stance kind of on that. We should all be, protected from harm, and vaccine testing is a very, very minor way of doing that. And the Supreme Court did take an active stance in blocking that. And going on to our next kind of news story related to the Supreme Court, the Supreme Court has refused to intervene in the Texas abortion ban. And so people who are not familiar with the background of this case, you can go to, actually, TexasTribune.org has some stuff on it, but you can kind of, even the Wikipedia page on Roe versus Wade has updates on this, and you could check things out there. But essentially, abortion became a quote-unquote right with Roe versus Wade, which said women had rights to have an abortion. They had rights to bodily autonomy and to make these decisions for themselves, because it is their body that is incubating, right, a fetus that, if born, would become a baby. And we've slowly seen the erosion. This is not a sudden erosion of rights. This is a long standing erosion of rights after, with case after case to the Supreme Court. I'm not a legal scholar. I did do some minor constitutional law during my undergraduate for my poli-sci minor, so I know a few things, but I'm not claiming to be a legal authority here. But the last I heard, Casey versus Planned Parenthood was the new Supreme Court kind of like standard, or like the subsection, like the little star next to Roe versus Wade was Casey versus Planned Parenthood, which stated that abortion was no longer a constitutional right, but it was a liberty interest. But what the court failed to do was really define what a liberty interest was. It doesn't say how that is any different from a constitutional right, but it definitely makes a distinction that it is less than. On top of that, they also place a restriction that states now get to decide what is an undue burden. So it is no longer up to the really Supreme Court, but to the states to decide what is an undue burden when it comes to women's access to health care, namely abortion. And so we see conservative states after that case reduce the amount of clinics they had, all the way down to a state like Texas now closing and banning all abortion clinics. And we still see the Supreme Court, after Casey versus Planned Parenthood, decide not to touch this case. Their concept is just see how it plays out. But what they're really doing is denying the human rights of every woman in Texas. And there's no other way of putting that. And again, this goes back to the idea that the Supreme Court is now an activist court in the worst way possible. It is one that is actively proactively going out, and not reactionary, but going out ahead of the curve and purposefully violating our human rights. So that is kind of the more negative news I'm going to be covering, but I do want to end on some good news. There are more Starbucks unionizing across the nation, and I do want to dedicate kind of the good news segment to my late comrade, Mimi Soltysik. He always emphasized in hanging on to our small victories, because the fight against capitalism and the fight for human rights and democracy, democratic access to the systems of power in place is an intergenerational battle. So we might not live to see all of our victories, or the overarching victory, right? The changing of capitalism into a more fair and humane system. But we can take the time that we have here to celebrate and recognize all the smaller victories we have towards human rights. And it doesn't matter how small or how big, they should always be recognized. And so today I do want to recognize that more Starbucks are unionizing. As of today, which is, I have to find a date, January 24th, 2022, about 33 Starbucks stores have turned in union cards across 14 states. So we do see this mass movement in worker rights going on, and Starbucks is kind of at the forefront of that. So I do want to recognize that. And that is the end of our Human Rights U.S. News segment. Next, we're going to go into our recommended reading list, or kind of what I'm reading right now. And I do recognize I should probably put some music between our segments. I will be looking at more of that. Right now, it's just me announcing. But anyway, recommended reading. Right now, what I'm reading, what I have been reading, because it's a seminal kind of like cornerstone book that I use all the time in my own research and my own writing, is Caliban and the Witch by Silvia Federici. And the description from AK Press is as follows. Caliban and the Witch is a history of the body in the transition to capitalism, moving from the peasant revolts of the late Middle Ages to the witch hunts and the rise of mechanical philosophy. Federici investigates the capitalist realization of social reproduction. She shows how the battle against the rebel body and mind are essential conditions for the development of labor power and self-ownership, two central principles of modern social organization. And this is a quote from Peter Linebaugh. In the neoliberal era of postmodernism, the proletariat is whited out from the pages of history. Federici recovers its historical substance by telling its story starting at the beginning within the throes of its birth. This is a book of remembrance of a trauma burned into the body of women, which left a scar on humanity's memory as deep and painful as those caused by famine, slaughter, and enslavement. End quote. So for anybody out there, you can probably find free PDFs of this book. You could probably find free PDFs of any book. If you're able to purchase this book and support Federici, I would suggest you do so. This book took an enormous amount of time for her to put together, and it really shows. It does look at women's bodies as an area of sacrifice during early capitalism, the closure of the commons, but it also just looks at some of the myths of history, this idea that the transition to capitalism was smooth or natural, and it really looks at the work behind it and how I believe one of her quotes is, and I've used this quote before for work at the Maggie Fair Institute, is how capitalism is one of the most conservative revolutions to ever take place that really kept those with power in power and with their capital and put everybody else kind of in a position to have to adhere to the system or die. And so again, I cannot recommend this book enough. If you are able to, please pick up a copy of Caliban and the Witch by Silvia Federici. And now we are going to move on to our main topic, which is an interview with a former Starbucks employee. Today we have with us a former Starbucks employee that wishes to remain anonymous, but is happy to talk to us about their working conditions they experienced as a Starbucks employee, as well as their point of view on Starbucks around the nation unionizing. Welcome, and thank you for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
Can you tell us a bit about your background while keeping it anonymous?
Yeah, so I worked for Starbucks for a little bit over a decade and had a few years of experience in food service prior to that.
And you were also what they call a partner as well as a shift lead, correct?
Yes, so I was a barista, which was entry level, and had experience as a shift as well in the store, which is the next step up.
What were the working conditions like at Starbucks pre-COVID-19?
I would say the overarching theme or commonality between the stores I was at would be that we always were understaffed, or at least felt so. So it just felt like there was not enough people to get the job done for what they were requiring us to do, whether it be food production or otherwise.
And what was Starbucks' sick policy like before COVID-19?
So Starbucks had a policy of making it the person calling out their responsibility to try and find coverage for their shift that they are no longer going to be there for. Rather than making it the employer's responsibility to find coverage, they would try to push that on to the employee with varying degrees of success. So to me, it was a little difficult because if you're legitimately sick, how are you going to be able to contact people? If you're bedridden, how are you going to be able to contact people? What have you? Or if you're in the hospital. So I didn't really agree with that policy very much.
Do you feel that Starbucks' policy of understaffing workers had an effect on people taking sick leave?
Yes, because because the staffing was so bare bones, any person calling out would have an effect on day-to-day operations, or like the shift that they would supposed to be there. It would be catastrophic for that day part, even one person calling out. And so as someone that can be both the recipient of being short or being the person calling out, when you are calling out, you know what you're doing to your fellow employees because of how difficult it is when you're on the other side. Because the staffing is so bare bones, If one person out of four is now missing and now you have three, that's 25% of your labor right there. And so it is almost impossible to get everything done with a full staff in ideal circumstances. If you're throwing in missing a person into the mix, critical things are now going to be a struggle, if not outright impossible to achieve.
So let's go back and maybe talk a little bit about like day-to-day operations. What are your responsibilities as a barista, and how does Starbucks kind of like measure your quote unquote like success in a day?
So as a barista, which is the entry level position, you are assigned to certain positions within the store, whether that be drink production, warming food, order taking, cash handling, stuff of that nature. So depending on what your position is at that time, which you would be rotating throughout the day, due to people needing to take breaks, you have those are your main responsibilities. Your secondary responsibilities would be cleaning and other preparatory things and stocking of that nature. The way that they would structure their scheduling is there's no designated blocks for you to get those secondary tasks done. It's due to you to do it during quote unquote slow periods. So the problem with that is sometimes there are no slow periods, and yet the expectation is still there. It does not deviate or change. And so what that can cause is days where you're incredibly busy. Hypothetically, maybe you have a call out at the same time. There is little to no opportunity to get those secondary tasks done. So what are you supposed to do to get those things done? The only way to do it is now to take more time, because now everything's been pushed to the end of the day. Now you're closed. Now sometimes, and more often than not, a lot of things would need to be done at closing and create your closing period where customers cannot interrupt to be that much longer. Throughout my tenure, they went from an hour when we were closed to when we needed to be out. So the store would close. We'd have an hour between that closing time to when we actually left the premises. It went from an hour, then it turned into 45 minutes, and then finally it now sits half an hour. And yet the responsibilities did not change. And in some cases, more responsibility was added with the same amount of coverage. And so basically what ends up happening is more time is needed because of those responsibilities being unchanged.
Yeah, thank you. And when they added things like seasonal drinks or new menu items, did they ever kind of give you additional coverage or extra time?
They may give us additional coverage to learn the drinks as far as meeting those metrics for your speed of service goals, which are absolutely crucial in earning, quote unquote, earning your labor so you can dole it out to your store. Those metrics wouldn't change. So you would be given certain metrics you need to meet during your busiest day part in order to earn labor for your store. However, they would be more often than not pushing a new drink that would be multi-step and take more time compared to other typical drinks or items on the menu. So that therefore they're creating a bottleneck that you have to overcome with no additional tools or changing the requirements in order to meet them. So the requirements stay the same, and they're actively creating an obstacle for you to meet them and then blaming you for not meeting them.
Did the working conditions change during the ongoing COVID-19 crisis? How so, if so?
Yes, there was a lot of ambiguity in the early stage of the pandemic about what was going to stay open and what wasn't. And so we all assumed that, essential employees, well, we're not essential, but yes, food service was essential as it turned out. And so initially the assumption was that we were all going to stay open and have plastic barriers and just ask everyone to wear a mask and everything will be fine. That was the attitude coming from corporate. And as it turned out, we all know that it wasn't fine. And so rather than the company protecting its workers and taking a hard stance against people who weren't wearing masks and being basically biohazards, they were instead taking a stance of just pacifying those types of customers and getting them out as quickly as possible. And to me, that doesn't make sense on two fronts. For one, you're not protecting your workers. They don't feel like they're being protected. And for two, it doesn't make sense from a business standpoint, because if you're not protecting them health-wise and one of them gets sick, then it's affecting your store, and that affects your revenue stream, just talking from a business standpoint. So that didn't make sense to me on either front, both from their perspective and for the employees. And so, yes, they had, plastic barriers, and there were times that we became drive-through only, which was a blessing. And that was either due to the pandemic changing or worsening, or staffing shortages. And that was actually better than having the lobby open, because we had more control over who was in the stores and how they're behaving. Because if there were people outside not wearing masks, first of all, for one, the distance is greater. And for two, if they are coughing or what have you, we can simply shut the window. If they're in the store not wearing masks, being biohazards, we have much less control over stopping the spread of COVID potentially. And so I'm sure everyone is aware of when customers are asked to do things, a lot of times they'll get hostile. And when they're in a vehicle and you're behind a window, all you need to do is simply close that window and wait for them to leave. Much harder to do so when they're physically inside your store.
Did Starbucks' sick policy change at all during COVID-19?
So yeah, I believe it was statewide where there was mandated COVID time that would be paid. So that was due to the states, not by anything done by Starbucks as a whole. They did offer during the initial stages 2 weeks, paid time off during the initial stage of the pandemic. And they announced that. And then they also said people that chose to remain at the store could, but there was no monetary incentive to do so. So people that wanted to stay were taking a risk, and there was no added benefit to doing so. So logically, why would anyone choose to put themselves and their family at risk by remaining at the store? It was only after backlash and realizing how stupid that was that they added catastrophe pay for anyone that was staying at the store during the early stages of the pandemic.
What was Starbucks' management like for you as a Starbucks employee without union representation?
So we talked earlier about how difficult it was to achieve our goals and metrics throughout the store, even under ideal circumstances. And so that was a common theme throughout my tenure there, and common throughout Starbucks, as I've heard throughout, voiced by my peers, my direct peers, and elsewhere via the internet. And so because of this common theme of struggling to meet your goals, in order to maintain your standing and not feel like there was a target on your back, there were additional means to make sure you were in the good graces of both your direct manager and beyond. And basically what that amounted to was making it a popularity contest to make sure you were feeling comfortable with your stability of your job. So because those metrics, those sales metrics are largely unattainable, you have to brown nose in order to feel secure in your job, to have any kind of standing. And this was common and pervasive throughout the company, from what I understand.
So you get a markup. How many markups are allowed in your employee file before they could technically fire you?
Well, in terms of attendance, technically, if you were late 3 times within a 90-day period, I believe, you could be let go like that, easy peasy. But there was discretion that the manager was allotted. I saw employees that far exceeded that, and the manager simply chose not to fire them for whatever reason. So there was deviation from that. The manager did have, discretionary input to those kinds of decisions, but mostly it was based off of Attendance wise was a big metric. They gauged that, and then also any kind of stealing or like taking of company property, obviously, just on the spot firing. If they could prove that you were stealing either money or food, you could be fired like that. But the main way people got fired was usually attendance issues.
So let's say it's a magical day, it's a magical month. You guys meet your goals and your metrics, and everybody is happy, shiny. You're closed on time. Nobody goes overtime. Everything's clean and beautiful. What rewards do the baristas and the shift leads get for all of their labor?
Nothing. A thank you, maybe. If quarterly goals are met or exceeded, the manager gets a monetary bonus, but none of that is awarded to the shifts and baristas. If a boss is above average in how good they are or liked by their employees, they might throw a pizza party like we're 10 years old. But largely all the rewards go to the store manager, who for the most part is logistically scheduling people. The people that are actually following out, doing the job and achieving those goals don't get anything for it beyond their normal pay.
So if you guys meet your store goals, your manager gets rewarded. Is the manager ever on the floor? Do they ever help earn that bonus for that perfect work day?
Yeah, somewhat, depending on the managers. Again, that's kind of discretionary based on the manager themselves. Some would help, some would not at all. And you'd have varying degrees of competency from those store managers. Some would be almost as good as the baristas and chefs, and some would be absolutely a hindrance to meeting those goals. And so you'd have varying degrees of assistance with that. A big thing that Starbucks would push would be having individualized, personalized connections, almost like similar to how it would be in a neighborhood coffee shop. That would be more of a leisurely kind of atmosphere, while at the same time pushing these speed of service goals. So they simultaneously wanted you to have personalized interaction scores that were rated based on random responses through the receipt and the app and the phone app, and also having speed of service goals, which were largely two contradictory things. They wanted you to be as fast as possible, yet at the same time having each interaction being unique, individualized, leisurely interactions, be able to connect with them. And so because of this, because the manager would be pushed to have these, personalized connections with their customers, they would have to stop, connect with them, which would create a hindrance on those speed of service goals and what have you. And we would all be, pushed to being connective or connecting with the customers. It's just the managers even more so. And so the employees get a better feel for when they can connect more in depth and when they have to put their head down and go. So the managers a lot of times would just be leisurely or quite even just simply in the way because of either prioritizing personalized connections or just being bad at doing what their subordinates do, which is food and drink production.
Did you have any interaction with corporate Starbucks? What was your experience, again, as that employee without any kind of union representation when it came to corporate Starbucks policies and how they were enacted upon the stores and upon the employees?
So I would define corporate as the district manager and above. And so my interaction with corporate Starbucks mostly was the district manager. And so my experience with the district manager and I had a variety of them over my tenure, my experience with them was largely a stress-inducing experience, mostly due to the fact that when their scheduled visits did come, everyone had to be in positions for optics' sake to make us look as best as possible from the viewpoint of the DM. So normally you'd have people in positions to get ancillary tasks done, food pulls, and make sure everything is well-oiled and the operation is going smoothly. However, when the district managers would arrive, it's all hands on deck, and everyone is on the sales floor or the food production floor in order to make those speed of service, make that optically as best as possible for the district manager. So from their viewpoint, everything is perfect and they're the best we could possibly be. So meanwhile, while they're there, all those behind the scenes preparatory and cleanliness tasks are simply not being done, where otherwise they would be had the DM not be there. So what that's causing now is, for optics' sake, all these side tasks that still need to get done, mind you, are now being pushed back throughout the day, and so it creates a bottleneck where all these things still need to get done. It's being done later and dumped on probably the next shift part because, oh well, the district manager was here, and so this this facade is created. See, district manager, look how perfect everything is. Look how great we are. But meanwhile, it's like, well, you're not doing this, you're not doing that. But either the district manager doesn't know or just pretends to not know. And so, more often than not, the closing shifts lead and the barista team with them would now have additional responsibilities to have to get done because of the district manager visit. And we talked earlier about largely it was borderline impossible to get these things done under ideal circumstances. So basically what ended up happening anytime the DM was there is now you're guaranteed to get out late when you're closing. And depending on the manager, you may or may not get talked to about that.
Yeah, and so the policies that they come up with, do corporate listen to their employees at all when they come up with how things should operate, or how do they come up with their operation protocols?
I think the main channels for corporate to get feedback from the stores were largely coming from the store managers, and it was filtered that way. But I believe that those channel streams or those open channels of communication were largely for show, and corporate really didn't take that feedback to heart to make any changes. The overarching theme I experienced when working at Starbucks throughout my tenure through a variety of stores was more responsibility and little to no change in tools to meet those goals, or outright making those tools less effective by cutting labor. And so there's more responsibility and not additional staffing to accommodate that or achieve it. In fact, like I said, they would often go the other way. As time went on, labor would get more and more strict and more sparse, and yet they're adding more and more responsibility. And so I understand from a business standpoint what they're trying to do. The wages of the employees are the biggest cost of overhead for their profitability. Okay, I understand that. But at a certain point, you need the right tools to get the job done. You can't, we're not magic. We're not, wizards. We don't just conjure things with a wave of a hand. You need tools and people on the floor to do things within the time frame you allow. So if you're going to continue to cut people, what ends up happening is because there's physically not enough people there to get the job done, it basically just takes longer. And so you're sabotaging yourself anyway by trying to have less labor, because now you're taking more time to do it with less people, which amounts to more labor costs anyway. So you might as well just have people there from the get-go and not have them be burnt out and angry and not do a bad job because of their rushing. And so you're basically wearing out your quote-unquote tools faster and making them either leave or what have you, or build resentment because you're not willing to have the labor there in the first place, which you're largely going to pay for anyway by them going over. And getting out late was a common theme that occurred throughout my tenure. Very rarely throughout my decade plus in Starbucks did stores get out on time. Very rarely. I could count on my two hands the amount of times I can remember that happening. And it was more often than not that stores would get out late because of everything being pushed to the end of the day due to their imbalance in how they structured their tasks versus labor.
What do you think about the recent growth in unionization across Starbucks across the nation? As of right now, something like 33 stores have filed union cards.
Well, I'm absolutely in support of it for a few reasons. And one is that all companies have HR, which exists solely to protect the company. And so right now, post-Reagan, all the leverage is in the hands of employers. And so there's really nothing the employees have as far as protecting themselves from unethical or predatory business practices. And so I absolutely believe that unionization across the country is absolutely necessary for workers, both economically for the country as a whole, and for to benefit workers for their standard of living. But even becoming invaluable to the organization, all the leverage is still in the hands of the employer. And so something needs to change, because right now, this top heavy distribution of wealth is eventually going to create the entire system to topple over and collapse, just due to a complete disappearance of the middle class and spending power. And so I do think that union membership is a good, an essential step in mitigating that, because workers need power to negotiate their wages and better working environments, because if we don't do something about it, the entire system will collapse.
So, is there anything else you'd like to share about your experience as a former Starbucks employee?
Starbucks is the industry leader. They're one of the most profitable corporations on earth. They can afford to have every single one of their stores unionized and still be profitable. Any kind of doomsaying or the sky is falling that union membership would destroy the business is simply capitalist propaganda.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here today and for sharing your experience and your point of view.
Thank you.
Now, for the fourth segment of our podcast, we are going to review some of the resources on the Maggie Fair Institute's website. As of 1/26/2022, we actually have a blog post that is a guide to unionizing. We touch on the history of unionization, the benefits of unionization, and also our own little infographic on how to start a union at your workplace. And then finally, we have links to resources that might be helpful if you're trying to unionize your workplace. We have one that comes from DSA and the EU union, and we also have resources from IWW, or the International Workers of the World. So if you would like to unionize, if this podcast or our past episode has inspired you to look into unionization, we do have those resources for you, along with many others, on MaggieFairInstitute.org. Now on to our final segment, which I'm really hoping to get some input from listeners on. We now have an official email for the podcast. It is simply the podcast's name, Exit Capitalism Stage Left, as one word, @gmail.com. In this segment, I'm envisioning getting questions or comments from you guys, or even maybe smaller topics to talk about related to human rights and capitalism. And I would be happy to answer them. I do have an academic background as well as an activist background in these things. And so I would really like to make myself an open resource to address any questions, comments, or concerns you guys may have when it comes to the themes that we talk about within this podcast. Thank you all once again for listening. This has been Exit Capitalism Stage Left. I have been your host, Amanda Riggle, and this podcast is brought to you by the Maggie Fair Institute for Democracy and Human Rights. And I will be seeing you guys next month, maybe with that episode with Matt Milholland talking about Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos. If not, we might be talking about that shifting definition of the middle class and what it means today and how that's different from what it meant in the past. Thank you again for listening.